Last week, I once again drove that Highway 93, that highway that takes from Vegas going south to Kingman and then jogs on over and take that south down to Wickiup and Wickenburg and on into Phoenix and then on from there down to Tucson. It's that Highway 93 that in times past, and even today, I suppose, has been known as the Killer Highway. The Killer Highway because it's a mighty dangerous stretch of road that's there. A dangerous road in the past, even more so, when it was really hardly divided and hardly ever passing lanes, and so many curves and corners and people passing at dangerous times. Dangerous place to go. But it's that highway, when you go down that highway and pass over the dam, and you look out into the desert, that you discover some beauty that's there. It's a dangerous beauty, you know what I mean? It's a beauty that you see the astounding wonder and magnificence of the desert. It stretches on as far as the eye seems to be able to see it. That desert land that just goes and goes, and the ridges and after ridge that's there. It's a nothingness that seems to stretch on, but a nothingness that has a pure, magnificent beauty, a stark beauty. And you look out into it and you can see the sun kind of often just coming off those hills and the changing colors that are there. It's a beauty that draws the eye and draws you out into that desert, but also causes you to really think, it's there that I would not want to be alone. I would not want to go out there and out there in the middle of nowhere. It's something that kind of draws you to it, but then you stay on the safety of the highway and the road, not venturing hardly off past the scenic overlook that looks over that vast expanse of that beautiful desert. The desert has that sense to it, that way that it's powerful and mighty and beautiful and dangerous at the same time, a place that is that rugged beauty. Our wilderness that we will go through in life, those times of wilderness that we'll sometimes feel and experience in life, may not be the actual desert that we're in the midst of, but it can kind of parallel that. It can remind us of that. Because those wilderness times of our lives may be something that's happened in life, like a dead-end job that we're in the midst of, and it's not going anywhere. And you feel dried up with the job, hopeless, or like it's not fulfilling at all. Or maybe a relationship you're in the midst of that, too, is in that dry and desert place. There can be feelings of loss. There can be feelings then of just disappointment sometimes in life. When our dreams aren't quite fulfilled in the way that we had hoped that they would be. Or maybe it's illness, or maybe it's bereavement because someone close to you has died. A wilderness time, a desert land in the midst of. A time when you're far from a land that you've been familiar with and yet not yet to that place of promise and that hope, just like the Israelites out there in that wilderness. Why do the Jews, the Hebrew people, kept telling that story over and over again? That story about, you remember when we were held as captive and oppressed in Egypt? And then God heard us and came to us and set us free? You remember that time when we, God's people, were out in the wilderness and there we had nothing, and it was God who then provided the manna from heaven. It was God who then provided that water that came right from the rock. And they would tell that story over and over again and still do to this day. Why does this story keep being told over and over again? Perhaps you know of somebody in your own life, maybe even you yourself have gone through those times of just telling the same story over and over again. Because they're stories that tell us who we are. Because they're stories that tell us, about our faith and about life and about where we're going. They're stories that have formed us and forged us, and we want to pass them on to a next generation, to another people. So we keep remembering when, so that we know where then we're going and heading in life. You remember when we felt all was lost? There was not a chance of any hope out there in the wilderness, but then God was there with us, and God saved us. We tell the story of then so that we know how to have a future, that God indeed will be with us in our new day and what's to come. There was a doctor who had done a study at Emory University, Dr. Marshall Duke, a psychologist. It did a study about healthy families and healthy communities. And there, when he did this study about what is it to be a healthy community or a healthy family, he discovered this thing about storytelling that they had in common. A way of telling stories to one another, a way of sharing with one another about the road that they've traveled and what has happened in life, and telling the next generation what that story has been, and the trials and the challenges that have been there. That's that single most important thing, and it seems so simple, doesn't it? It seems like something we just take for granted about telling the stories, about those remember whens, about sitting around the dining room table and sharing the stories of times gone by and what's happened to us. It seems like just a simple thing that you just do. But it's not always so that we do it enough, especially when we don't have enough dinner time together with our families, or our families are spread far and wide, and we're busy people. We do a lot of things, go in a lot of directions. So it's not quite as simple, maybe, as to being able to just share those stories. We often have to make the occasion happen. We have to make it so that we're in one place at one time, or across the miles, we can find out how to share the stories with one another. But it's not just in sharing any old story, it's sharing the stories in a particular kind of way, and the way in which we can see reflected, actually, here in our Scripture. From the Old Testament right into the New, about the way in which we need to be sharing our story. Not just any old way, but in a way that gives us a renewal and a strength that lifts us up. Because every time we tell the story about what's happened to us in the past, we're new people, we're different people from what we were before the last time we told. And so it's told in a way then that reflects who we are now in deeper insights and understandings. And our memory then gets triggered for other things that really did take place that you forgot about. And you include it back into the story, so you retell it. So there apparently are 3 different ways you can tell these stories. The first way that you can tell the story is this thing called descending narrative. It's a descending narrative is a story that kind of says, you know, sweetheart, we used to have it all, and then we lost everything. You tell the story about how everything just went all the way downhill and all these bad things happened. You know, sometimes we get trapped into that place of telling how awful something has been. And we tell that story then about how terrible and how hard we had it back then, you know, the difficult times we had and how trying it was. And we had it all, and then it was all just gone in a moment. And we tell the stories about whether it's that Great Depression or that Great Recession now. And you tell the story in that way, but there's a sense in which the story is a descending narrative, that you're left then, well, what does that mean for us today? There's this other way that one can tell a story, though. It's the ascending narrative, of course. You go down in one, but the other one you go up. And you go up because you tell the story that says, son, when Grandpa came to this country, he didn't have anything. He didn't have a job, he didn't have anything at all but what was carried in his suitcase, and then he found that job and he worked hard as he could. Worked so hard, he got so much, he was able to save enough and scrimp enough that your dad could go to college. I was able to go to university and graduate from there, and that's why I've got the job that I've got. And I work hard too, so that you can have what you need, son, so that you can have that kind of an opportunity for school and for employment, and you too can be lifted up to a yes. You see, that's that story that's told of success, 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 success. But those 2 ways of telling the story only tell part of it. And where the true health comes from, Dr. Duke has said, is with an oscillating story. A story that says and tells all of the facets and all of the truth. And how it was that the trials and the difficult things that happened actually brought us together. And we figured out how to work it with one another as a family. We made it through because we could see that God was always with us. And then the faith story becomes kind of coming into that. And it was then when we discovered that it's not in all the stuff that we have. It's not in all of the wonderful home and the wonderful things that are around us, but we discovered that it's just that we have each other. I remember a time that David, my younger brother, and I were just tussling back and forth. We had a season of our lives in which we couldn't stand to be in the same room with each other. We just fought back and forth and scraped and scrapped and wrestled one another to the ground. My mother came into the room one day, our bedroom, where we were fighting with one another, and she said, "Enough, boys, enough already." And so we broke it up, and she said, "I have a story to tell you." You know, it was a story of my sister Lorraine and I. You see, Aunt Lorraine and my mom just seemed like they were just bonded together and sisters who really loved one another and cared for one another. "What do you mean you fought as kids?" I couldn't believe it. I didn't think that could ever be so. I couldn't imagine my mother fighting with her sister, but she said, "Yeah, there was a time in which we did. We couldn't get along with one another at all. In fact, there was a time in which I was out on the porch swing in our family home in Cameron, Wisconsin. And there I was just swinging there in the backyard, and Lorraine came up, and we were just having a wonderful time. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a big rock comes landing right on my head. It was awful," she said. "It hurt. I was just knocked out totally. I didn't even know where that rock came from until I learned that it came from Lorraine's hands." Yeah, sweet Aunt Lorraine threw a rock right at me. You ever believe it, would you? Well, how did they get from that place of fighting with one another, throwing rocks so that my mother was knocked unconscious, to a place where they cared and loved one another and had family reunions and couldn't wait the next time we get together? Well, that wasn't the only part of the story that was there. It was the rest of the story that just kept unfolding as I learned more through the years. "Yeah, we fought," she said at that time when we made up. But it wasn't until years later, perhaps when Mom realized that we were older and we needed to know more about family, where she said, "You know, that rock that Lorraine threw and it landed on me, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a rock that she threw up into the air, maybe throwing it at God. Maybe she was really throwing it at me to hurt me because she hurt inside so deeply. And so did I. We all did," she said, "because it wasn't long before that our mom, your Grandma Ruth, she was just 36 years old, and she contracted cancer, and she died. And it was an awful time in our family. There were 6 kids, and the oldest was Aunt Lorraine, 9 years old. It was an awful time, a desperate, painful, lonely time. That's where that rock came from. And I later realized that. Later, after some time, when our family was separated and we had kids be shipped off into different homes and families, but then we were able to come back together again. Well, how did that ever happen? How can you overcome such pain and such awful things that would happen in life? And where was God in the midst of that? It was that she described it as a time of grace and forgiveness that suddenly in their family reunited them. It wasn't exactly suddenly, because they were seeped in the faith. They were shown through their times in Sunday school as children about the grace of God and the love of Jesus. And she said that's where it really came from. It just came then so that we knew our greatest treasure was with one another. And they knew that the gift was having a sister, was having brothers in the faith too, and others. And God brought us back together again. You know, you come to know Jesus and life is healed. You come to know Jesus and a wholeness comes out of that place of brokenness that we've had and that place of pain that we've had. And God leads us then into a new place and into a new time of life, when you then begin living again and having some joy and having some resurrection in life. How can you ever be lifted up a place of death? But through the grace of God in Jesus, the bread of life given to us. We must tell that story, and we must tell it often. How has the bread of life come into your life? How has Jesus himself shown up right at the right time in your life to mend you and to heal you and to unite you with others around you who may have brought the most harm and pain to you in life? Those times of obstacles, of conflict. Tell this story to others and seek, indeed, now in those broken places in your life, about the bread of heaven coming to you to heal and to make whole so that you can find that place of greatest grace and healing.